Over the past few weeks, the New Statesman's new editor, Tom McTague, has been profiling Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister. The feature is the cover story of this week's magazine. It draws on 4 interviews with Keir Starmer. And you've worked to capture the internal logic of the Prime Minister. You've worked to try and understand what the core purpose of this government is as it approaches its 1-year anniversary. You travelled with him on land, on sea, in the air, wearing a strange jumpsuit. You call it at one point Top Gun for Social Democrats. Where have you been? Where have you taken? Where has our Prime Minister taken you?
Well, I remember getting the call actually and say, would you like to join the Prime Minister on a trip to an aircraft carrier? And I thought, God, yes, I want to go to an aircraft carrier. And we went up to this place called RAF Northolt, which is up in Ruislip in northwest London. And from there, we took this military aircraft down towards Cornwall. And then we got into these jumpsuits, as you say, these sort of giant rubber things, incredibly awkward to get on. And this was, we were told, in case the helicopter that we were then getting in fell into the sea or, crash landed, which is a bit sort of nerve-wracking as you're sort of strapping yourself up. But then you have this scene, and it was almost like Under Siege, the movie where you're flying into this aircraft carrier and you're landing on the airstrip, and then you're taken down underneath. And these are the sort of pride and joy of the Royal Navy now. These giant aircraft carriers. I think they have like 8 decks below, 8 decks on top. Absolutely enormous. Carry about 1,000 people on board these things, and then they have the space for the F-35s, these American planes. So there's interoperability with the American military. And we watch them taking off. And, they need something like, I remember Starmer looking on, and I thought it was quite telling. He says, God, they only need 100 yards to take off. And he uses yards, doesn't use meters. He's a sort of,
He's an Englishman.
He's an Englishman of a certain age,
Yeah.
I thought. But yeah, I travelled him to there. I then followed him to Oslo, where he was joining a meeting of the Joint Expeditionary Forces, a group of like 10 Northern European countries who have come together militarily to form this 10,000 strong force. Again, all very sort of martial build-up here. And then I had a beer with him, which I think we'll talk about in number 10. And then finally, I followed him to Glasgow, again with a kind of military theme, where he is talking, unveiling the Strategic Defence Review, which in his words was putting Britain on a war footing.
So this piece is about Starmer, but there's a background to it, which I think those places illustrate. The background is a darkening security picture. You've got an isolationist America, who Starmer's trying to sort of pull into NATO, you say. We've got Europe, a continent at its edge, involved in the most serious and brutal war since World War II. And Russia probing our defences, which is something you're sort of told by Starmer's people, that some of these ships you're on have actually been involved in quasi-confrontations with the Russians. How much of Starmer's time is now spent thinking about national security?
I think a lot. I think it certainly frames a lot of his own thinking, and it combines his worldview, his instinct about Britain and what it is for, and I think an instinct about how you start to rebuild a sense of purpose in the country. So if you listen to his language over the Strategic Defence Review, it's all about no longer having a peace dividend, which he talks about after the Cold War, but having a new dividend where the spending that we start to inject into the economy to rebuild the military forces benefits directly parts of the country that he thinks have been left behind in those years of globalization. So that is the kind of at a core of what this government is about. They struggle to articulate it, but that's the idea that is there, that you can, it's effectively leveling up the country in part through military spending, which is in part to bring the Americans or tie the Americans into Europe and to effectively put off the Russians from trying anything.
But when you say this, it sounds quite good. I think, yeah, that makes sense. Why hasn't that story landed so much? I mean, this is, again, one of the big themes of this profile is something not landing about the language, about the story that the government is telling.
Yeah, I think with Starmer, and I noticed this when I was sort of watching him interact with the sailors, whether it's in Oslo or aboard the Prince of Wales. It's not that he's awkward. He's not awkward. But he's not sort of a commanding presence, and he's not one of the lads. He's not one of the boys. In fact, when you watched John Healey, his defence secretary, he looked a little more at ease aboard the Prince of Wales. He was sort of laughing and joking with the troops. He looks more like a kind of blue Labour man who could deliver that message. Shaved head, shirt sleeves up. He was on board. He was out in the morning at 6 o'clock. The night that I stayed over on this aircraft carrier, and he's doing exercise with the soldiers. That's not.
Was Starmer having a lie-in?
Starmer was at working. That's the thing. Yeah. He's sort of in his office working diligently,
yes.
Getting on with things. So I think there is an element where he doesn't quite look like your kind of blue Labour man. Now that doesn't mean he can't land a message. Clement Attlee didn't look like a kind of patriotic Churchillian leader, and he held a cabinet together of bigger beasts than himself in many respects. This is a story that's been told before, but there is no doubt that Starmer finds it harder to articulate the kind of feelings, the raw feelings of the country in a way that you've seen previous leaders do it, whether it's Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair, or others before him, Harold Wilson in particular, articulating this sense of what the country feels about itself, what's sort of causing it to be stuck, what it thinks has gone wrong. He struggles with that. What he likes is to say that his work should do the telling. He gets on, he fixes one problem after the next. He makes sensible decisions, and over time he thinks they should speak for themselves.
And this is something you latch onto in his biography. Mm-hmm. Starmer is, by any reasonable standard, a very successful man. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's basically been good at everything he has ever done in his life, as far as we know, until this point. And he sort of says to you that he doesn't feel comfortable sort of saying how good he is. It's not quite the words he uses, but there's a modesty there. And I think there's also a slight arrogance that he's never had to say that he's good, because he simply demonstrates it. And now he can't just demonstrate it. This government has to fight every single day to prove that it is actually on people's side. And it's not quite happening.
Well, he has to both deliver, which is more difficult when you're trying to turn around a ship of state. You're trying to fix a country that has failed for 20 years. At best, it has been failing for only that long. In terms of living standards, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of its management of the finances or public services. This is a country which has not been successful for a long time, and he is trying to turn that around. So A, that is difficult, but B, this is a completely different skill that we're talking about here. This is not about just diligence. This is a job which is one of national leadership, and it's about connecting with the country and understanding the depth of that problem and what has gone wrong. It's the analysis. It's just a fundamentally more difficult job. We should say he's also pretty successful at politics. Most people that go into politics, in the back of their mind, think, I could be prime minister. A lot of them do. If you go into Westminster, almost none of them make it. Very, very successful politicians, very able men and women, come close to being prime minister and do not get it. So we should not think of him as an apolitical man. He is clearly political. He is the only director of public prosecutions to have used that position as a stepping stone to something else. A lot of them then go back into being a barrister or becoming a high court judge or going back into the city and making a lot of money. Starmer used it as a stepping stone to further responsibility, further power. And then he won the Labour leadership, and then he won an enormous landslide.
He practiced to be Labour leader for quite a long time. Almost as soon as he becomes an MP, he's starting to think about the leadership. But his advisors, who sort of peppered throughout this profile, they suggested to you that Starmer isn't really political. that he's detached, that he's not interested in Westminster rigmarole. He's not down Stranger's Bar. He's mild distaste for Westminster politics. I mean, you don't really seem to think that that's quite right.
It's not quite right in that he is political, in that he is ambitious, and he understands what is required to get to the top of national politics, and he did so. So we should never underestimate that. But what is absolutely true is that he does have a mild distaste for politics, the game, the theatre, as he called it to me, in one observation that I thought was quite telling. That's how he sees it. He sees these people who are, sort of frauds, and they're glib. And, he loathes Boris Johnson because he thinks he's everything that is wrong with politicians who go and play the game in Westminster, and they score points and they win and they create theatre in order to win headlines, and that they don't actually achieve anything. And if you think about the negotiations with the EU, he set out and he said to his negotiators, I do not want theatrics. I don't want red lines drawn in the sand. I just want it to be done quietly, and then I want to produce the deal at the end. And that's what happened. I was listening to a rival podcast with Ed Balls the other day, and Ed Balls was saying, well, this is not how we would have done it, George, to George Osborne. We would have had a fight. We would have created a fight. We would have won that fight, and then we would have caved on other issues quietly, and then we would have convinced the public. We would have led them with us. Starmer thinks, well, that's what they've all been doing, since Margaret Thatcher handbagged her way to the rebate, and look where it got us. That's his view. He looks at politicians and he thinks they don't actually, achieve much. But the rhetoric.
Yes. Well, let's talk about Johnson quickly, because Johnson's the last prime minister you profiled for The Atlantic, I think in 2022. And there are little moments in this profile where you mention Johnson and you compare Starmer and him. I went back and read the profile of Johnson, and what struck me as quite interesting is that Johnson tries to play games with you. I think there's a sense of cat and mouse in that profile. As you're just saying, there is no theatre, there is no cat and mouse with Starmer. You ask him questions, and he tries, I think, quite sincerely to give you answers.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's there are both similarities and differences between the two. The differences are more pronounced, obviously. The similarities are interesting in that what I think I found difficult with both of these men is to try and find something new that is real about them, that is raw, that is true. And with Boris Johnson, what you have to do is somehow stop the jokes for a minute and just break through into sincerity. And it's so difficult because he just doesn't want to go there. He will just throw all sorts of kind of guffaws and quips in your way, and gurns, everything to stop you kind of getting to some kind of truth. With Starmer, it's completely different. He is earnest and sincere, certainly earnest to his core. He can't be anything other than earnest. He struggles to kind of roll with a joke with, excited sailors are about to set off for 8 months. He's just drawn back to a kind of seriousness, and that is what he is. But at the same time, you're trying to find something where he's not on. He's not the prime minister. He's not being serious. He's not thinking about, policies or this or that he wants to fix. You just want to find Starmer the man. And on that's where he's different to Johnson, in that very quickly, in a conversation I had with him in Oslo, at the end of a day, and in fact, that was something that was really quite different with Starmer. If you got him towards the end of the day, when he was starting to relax, then you got much closer to the real Starmer. When I interviewed him during the day, when I was sandwiched between other things, and he was on as Prime Minister, and he was just waiting for the next thing that he had to do, the next interview with the BBC, or the next meeting with another group of people. It was harder to sort of break through. He was on sort of, he knew what he had to say, the lines that he wanted to get across. But in Oslo, to begin with, it was the end of the day, and we were up in a room, and he was about to fly to Poland, where he was going to get a train overnight with Macron and Merz and Donald Tusk to go to Kiev. And so he was relaxed. He didn't have anything else to do that day, probably apart from a few papers on the plane. And we had 15 minutes or so to talk. And the conversation got on to his family and his parents, and in particular his brother. Starmer raised this something that he'd said in the last speech to the Labour Party conference. And I'd remembered that he talked about his brother in that speech. And it was rare for Starmer because he doesn't talk about his brother. And his brother had died a few months after that, on Boxing Day, actually. And I wanted to ask him about that because he hadn't spoke publicly since. And I was really surprised how quickly the conversation became emotional, where his own emotion very quickly welled up to the surface. It was, in his eyes, he was visibly upset, sort of staring at me intently, not in any sort of threatening way, almost sort of vacant, thinking about his brother. And his eyes were full of tears, and at times he struggled to sort of convey what he was feeling.
I think this is important because there's a caricature of Starmer as this grey, dull, technocratic, managerial, all those words that have become in this era of populist insurgency, all those words that have become slurs. I remember when you told me about what happened when Starmer was on the verge of tears with you, and thinking the most famous quote in a previous interview that this Prime Minister has ever given is, "I don't dream." And yet there he was with you in Oslo, and the crust of managerial competence opened up, didn't it? And I got the sense, I don't know if you agree with this, I got the sense that he hadn't actually, there are things that Starmer has not really, just in terms of his emotions, not really had a chance to come to terms with.
I think that's right. I think he's quite an old-fashioned man, brought up in quite an old-fashioned English home, where his dad was quite removed, quite detached from him. And actually, Starmer talks about it now a bit more openly. His dad put everything emotionally into his relationship with his wife, Starmer's mother, who was disabled. She had Still's disease. And so she often couldn't walk. She was very ill, very vulnerable. And these were kind of sweethearts from a very early age. And the doctors had said to Starmer's mother she was unlikely to be able to have children. She went on to have 4. She is the icon of his life, without question. She is. He says to me, he will say to himself, if he's having a difficult day, "Come on, Keir, if your mum can get up and walk, you can do this." It's just, she is the inspiration beyond doubt. And they have 4 children. Starmer is the second one. And then after Starmer, his mother has twins. And Nick, his brother, Starmer's brother, has difficulties learning. He has, through complications of the birth. And so into this world that Starmer is born into this home, which has this sort of trauma hanging over it, which means that his dad is emotionally detached from the children, quite a grumpy man in all.
A socialist in the shed.
A socialist
how someone
in the
described
shed.
It to me once.
Yes. Yeah, fixing things and just getting on with it and just withdrawn, but quietly keeping press cuttings of his son proudly, but not ever being able to tell him that he's proud of him or that he loves him or anything like that. And Starmer, in turn, not being able to say that back to his dad, where his mother, this loving, sort of stoical woman. But his brother, incredibly vulnerable man, not able to succeed academically in the way that Keir did at the school, who spends an entire life of vulnerability, financially, emotionally, everything you can think of. But they remain close. They shared a bedroom as children. So Starmer, from an early age, is a kind of carer in a way that I hadn't quite appreciated. Probably not for his mum, because that's what his dad was doing, but for his brother, for his family, for the wider kind of. And he is the successful one. He goes to grammar school, then he becomes a university, then he becomes a lawyer, he becomes an incredibly successful lawyer. He becomes DPP. He is knighted. He keeps going. He keeps going. Keeps going. And every time he is drawn towards people who have suffered a trauma in their life.
This is it. This is another core part of the profile, and another thing that I think changes the way we should look at Starmer. People say he doesn't have an ideology. You sort of push him on this. You say, "What's the core of your politics?" And he interrupts you and says, "Human dignity."
Yeah,
and he means it. It's not spin.
No,
this is very, very deep inside him.
He interrupts me just to say it. He knows exactly what it is. So I'm asking about human rights, and there is a kind of story in Westminster that he's a human rights extremist, rather than a politician. He's not really a politician. He just believes in human rights and the rule of the courts. And I don't think that's quite right, because he moves from being a human rights lawyer to being a prosecutor, and to a lot of his human rights lawyer kind of friends, this is a kind of horrifying thing to do. You've changed. You're now on the side of the state prosecuting people. That's a different. But for Starmer, it's pragmatism. It's like, right, he faces these challenges and he compromises. So he mentions the Stephen Lawrence case, where he effectively moves against double jeopardy, the idea he can't be tried twice for the same crime, because he sees new evidence that he thinks is compelling enough to change it, and he pursues the prosecution of the Stephen Lawrence killers. And so he gives those examples and many others. But I think it's right. I think he's fundamentally a pragmatist. So there is not a huge ideology in a kind of political sense, like a Marxist ideology or anything like that. What there is that what you just said. He sees clearly what he stands for as being in defense of human dignity. And he sees it as the indignities that his brother suffered from bullies at school who called him thick and these kind of things. And he just, you see him tense up when he refers to this. I will never allow anyone to call anybody thick. He kind of gets angry. And we've all heard it, him talking about his father and the sort of perceived slights about his profession and his working class sort of identity and background. And Starmer again gets emotional about that. But I think there is a kind of, because he feels a kind of trauma, he sees a kind of trauma in his own life, he is drawn to it with others, and he wants in some senses to take on responsibility and to fix it. So you see it again and again throughout his career as DPP, and now as Prime Minister, where he meets with individual victims of horrific crimes or losses, and feels it, and he often actually becomes quite friendly or even friends with these people who he bonds with over these
he's extraordinarily sort of solicitous and understanding on a personal level. And it's interesting, he seeks trauma. And there's an argument, I think, in the piece that the country is pretty traumatized, and it has been since at least 2008. Many, many things in this century for Britain have not gone very well. Starmer should, if these things can be linked, somebody who deals with trauma well, why can't he do it for the country?
Well, that's the core, and this is where, is he a politician? Is he able to sort of connect? Why can't he sort of articulate those feelings? And I think there are a couple of ways of thinking about this. One, on one level, he doesn't really share that analysis. He doesn't see the country as traumatized in the way that I suggested to him. And I made that case that you've just made. I think you can make it, you could say, from the Iraq War onwards, a series of failures, of state failures, foreign policy failures, domestic failures, then into austerity, the financial crisis, then austerity, then Brexit, Libya, all of these, one after the other, after the other, then the pandemic, then the riots with Starmer. And that's not to mention, Johnson, Partygate, Liz Truss, the first country to be crushed by the bond markets in the way that happened, one after the other after the other. In the meantime, we're getting poorer and poorer compared to sort of many of our peers. People's living standards haven't improved. And then you have, the questions of migration and reform and all that kind of the drumbeat in the background of a kind of different, more dangerous kind of politics that is beginning to emerge on one side of politics. And Starmer, though, says, I don't see it as trauma. I see it as a disaffection. That's
That's
word
what he says. Yeah. Which is different,
right? Very different.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can be disaffected. And he believes, and I put this to him directly, you don't believe that the country, the model is fundamentally broken. And I think that's the core here. Is the model fundamentally broken? Post-2008, what is it that we're supposed to do as a country to
keep house prices rising?
Yeah.
So it's effectively it.
Yeah, so the housing market, isn't that broken? The financial system, the economic model that Britain depended on from Black Wednesday to the Lehman Brothers, that what if we replace that with all of these questions? The way that we the NHS is struggling at the moment after years of austerity, the taxation model, all of these things, the Treasury, everything's buckling. The military, our foreign policy. Look at Donald Trump, as you said before. The special relationship, the relationship with Europe. What is at the heart of this? And he says no. It's not fundamentally broken. The model is not fundamentally broken. It's fixable, and I can fix it, and it's one bit at a time. And then it's the question, okay, so you don't think there's this trauma, this sort of sense of a broken nation, but he gives speeches that sort of suggest that he might. Mm-hmm. And this is where I think there is this tension, because there's people close to him clearly are in a more pessimistic place.
Well, there are advisors who I think share your analysis of the country. And I don't know how much to say here, but, when Starmer goes out and gives the Island of Strangers speech, can you talk a bit about how that reflects what you're just saying?
I remember raising this with him, because the Island of Strangers speech, in which he's subsequently been likened to Enoch Powell, he is arguing, unless a sort of trust can be brought back into the system of border control, effectively, whether it's asylum or migration, that unless the state can show that it is in control, that the sense of nationhood and the ability to act, to develop and protect social democracy itself will start to be undermined. That's the core argument of the speech. And I say, you're the Prime Minister, sort of arming the country for war here at the same time.
No, you're on an aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
You're looking at submarines and planes, and it's about as serious as it can be in peacetime. It seems like.
Yeah, and you're saying that we need to be on a war footing, but at the same time, if we don't sort of pull together, we can't be a social democracy. There's a tension here, and he sort of immediately you see that he's uncomfortable with the Island of Strangers speech. He didn't want that to be the headline. He sort of seems to be saying he didn't want it to be the lesson. He goes, this is on me. I should have focused a bit more. I should have been able to articulate the other bit that he's talking about, which is coming together as different communities and sort of walking together, as he puts it. So he's focused entirely, he's very much focused on the sort of progressive element that he sees in that speech.
You think he regrets that speech?
I think he regrets it, certainly the emphasis and the way he articulated it. And that comes back to the point, right? He is a Prime Minister that is able to articulate and emote with individuals on an individual basis, often in private. And with me, he is able to show his emotion, talk about his brother, although he struggles to articulate his feelings. He says at one point, I I wasn't sure how to say it. I don't know how to explain it. And then he sort of pauses and he looks at me upset. But he's trying to, he's not embarrassed about it. He's trying to articulate it, but in some sense he can't, because his life is about head down, work harder, Keir, do what your mum did, and you will fix things and you will succeed, and this country's great and you will fix it, and you will, he doesn't want to make it great again. That's not kind of his vibe, but he wants to make it what it was.
Normal.
He wants to make it normal.
It's normal. It's less political. It's normal. What surprised me, actually, was that Starmer has a view of England and Englishness. I hadn't really known about this. He carries an idea in his head. Now, arguably, it's a bit of a cliched idea about England in his head. Mm-hmm. What is that idea, and what did it remind you of as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I remember saying to him, I'd been to the place where he was brought up, and it's this, as everyone knows, Pebble-Dash Semi in Surrey, basically, just on the other side of the M25 from memory, but sort of bordered by these gentle English green slopes and sort of woods, so you can't see, you don't hear the M25 or see it. It's this very pleasant place down a country lane, kind of Danny the Champion of the World is kind of how I think of it. And I say, it's very deep England. He's like, yeah, very deep England. And I think that is a part of him. He is, he sees England in a way that I think is how a lot of previous prime ministers have talked about it, as this land of sort of gentle kindness and decency and order.
He goes quite John Major on you at one point.
It's very John Major, but also Ted Heath. In fact, actually, if you think about those three figures that I've just mentioned, John Major, Ted Heath, and Keir Starmer, they're all from a similar class. So kind of lower middle class, who have achieved a lot more. They've risen in status, but they hold on to this vision of England at the core. Heath, Broadstairs and Bexley, Major, bit different, Brixton, but it's like he talks of the sort of cricket. Cricket
nuns
pitches.
On bicycles. Yeah, there's a genealogy that goes to Orwell here, isn't there? And it is deep.
But Major completely misses the point of Orwell, which Orwell is saying England is lost in this deep slumber of which I worry that it will never wake, because it is so gentle that it doesn't understand how the world is collapsing around it.
The wrong people are in charge, is what Orwell says.
Yeah,
and he'd quite like them to be kicked out.
Yeah, and Major's going, oh, isn't it wonderful? All these people who worry about the outside world, what are they worrying about? So it's so gentle and nice here. It's like Orwell's point was the opposite, John. But Keir Starmer and Ted Heath are similar in that respect, I think. And they talk about this world and they hold it up. And you could say Callaghan and Wilson, to a certain extent, have sort of similar views, Attlee as well. And I think you can make a case that a lot of those prime ministers end up being dragged from power. Wilson wasn't dragged from power, he resigned, but they end up leaving power, leaving office, bewildered, in a sense, by an England that is not the one that they dream of and that they hold in their kind of mind's eye. It's a less ruly place. It's more violent. It's more chaotic. It's angrier. It's not as polite. So how do we think, Ted Heath loses power? It's with miners' strike and asking the country who governs, and oil prices rocketing because of wars in the Middle East. And he's then bewildered ever more as the country departs into a Thatcherite future that he loathes.
He gets smashed. He gets smashed by the miners and then smashed by Thatcher.
Yeah, and he can't really deal with it, and he goes into his sort of eternal grump. Wilson retires a broken man sort of drinking to get through the day, unable to even walk his dog around Chequers. He's so exhausted, and at one point he says, "I'm retiring, or I'm leaving to think about the problems of the country," which is something to say as a prime minister, right? That's the kind of thing you're supposed to do first, and then sort of solve. And then you have Callaghan, who is a naval kind of veteran who from Portsmouth, from memory, who has these similar kind of patriotic visions.
Small C, conservative.
Exactly. And how does he? He is dragged from power in the winter of discontent. And Thatcher comes in, and she is, no, England, one side wins, one side loses. I'm going to smash the other side, and I will get people who don't vote for me to pay the price. That's sort of the message of Thatcherism. So I just think there is this danger for Starmer, and I put this to him directly, that you are, if we're living through this 1970s again, you are a sort of understandable 1970s politician, and if you're not careful, if you've got this wrong about England and about the depth of the problems in the country, well, then you will be one of these prime ministers whose England shocks them and crushes them, which is a little bit, he said, look at the riots, how the people came out after Southport. And I said, yes, but they were rioting in the first place.
Yes, and in ways that if you go through the sort of reports that Yvette Cooper commissioned after those riots, read about what the police capacity is, read about how those memes spread on social media very, very quickly before anybody could control it. And you do wonder, what is in the subterranean depths of the country just waiting there.
Trying to burn refugees alive.
Yeah.
Right. That's not gentle. That's a violent, under, subterranean part of England. Now, it's perfectly reasonable and probably accurate for Starmer to say that is not the majority. The kind of silent majority of this country remains decent and law-abiding and moderate and calm, polite, and all of those things. True. I think that's true. But, it's the core political analysis here is one from Starmer that this country is not, the country's model is not broken. It's fixable, and it's fixable through incremental change that he will deliver one after the other on everything. Economy, public services, foreign policy, military spending, everything. He will, through decency, being sensible, taking the heat out of it all, he will slowly fix the country in a calm and sensible manner of a manager. And the results will speak for themselves.
And his likely opponent in the next election, I mean, we don't know exactly who it's going to be. Is it going to be Farage? Mm-hmm. Is it going to be Kemi? Yeah. Is it going to be Robert Jenrick? But they're going to be making an argument which is anti-system. The likelihood is they're going to be making an argument which is the model is broken, the country is haywire, nothing's under control, and radical measures will be needed to reverse British decline, I think, ultimately. What do we... I mean, it's a bit ahead. We're skipping a bit ahead here, but you say that Starmer actually continuing as Prime Minister after 2029, perhaps in some sort of coalition with the Liberal Democrats, who knows, getting too far ahead now, but you say that's underappreciated in Westminster.
I mean, look at the majority, right? You look at the majority of the Labour Party, look at the fact that the country has not forgiven the Conservative Party for the last 14 years. That's clear.
Yeah.
The Conservative Party are still held largely in contempt by the public. And so the sort of fundamental conditions are there for re-election of the Labour Party. The Liberal Democrats have, a lot of seats. So what is it, 70, 80 seats?
Yeah, and they're putting their sort of tentacles down in the southwest, right. and they're digging in, and they'll probably continue to do quite well. Yeah,
and in fact, in the edition of this week's edition of the New Statesman, we run a piece by a former editor of the magazine, Paul Johnson, in which he talks about Callaghan doing a deal with the Liberals to remain in power. There are echoes of history all the way here. It's all I say is that it's not at all impossible that happens, and there is an emerging narrative which is quite clear and potentially quite powerful that those who seek to upend the gentle England of Starmer's vision are not to be trusted, and they are not kind of Margaret Thatcher figures who will, through brutality and violence, grip the nation. They are charlatans and chaos agents, and they're Liz Truss. They're Liz Truss 2.0. Yeah. That's it. Now, Jenrick, if he ever takes the Conservative Party, they will find it more difficult to sort of paint him as that. He is a much kind of more menacing figure, I think, to the Labour imagination, because there's a kind of dark competence to it. He's in those videos, he's poking at the rawest.
It's pain. He's finding the places where the country is in pain, I think. For if you have a sort of conservative mindset, these are things that drive you slightly mad. Fair dodging is a kind of proxy for all kinds of things, I think, in those videos. And so he's kind of twisting the knife in those things.
That's it. And, twisting the knife, is he twisting the knife in a traumatized country, as we go back to that point? But right now, Starmer doesn't talk about Jenrick. He never mentioned Kemi Badenoch once in my four interviews with him. He mentions Farage, and Liz Truss. And that is the frame at the moment. We should not underestimate its power. People still clearly hold Liz Truss in contempt for understandable reasons. And so I think you're seeing the outlines of the next general election forming quite clearly, but they're not set. They're not set in any sense because there are variables that we don't know. And one obvious variable is what's going to happen with the Conservative Party. But I think that sense that the Labour Party has, the Labour government and those around Starmer and Starmer himself, and I did put this to him, is that if he is wrong, if the country's problems are much deeper, much more systemic, they're not about poor leadership, individuals that made bad mistakes over the last 14, 15 years, 20 years, 25 years, however we want to characterize it. They are structural problems with the nature of the British economy and its state that are not fit for purpose. If Keir Starmer has got that wrong and he is seen to fail over the next 4 years, then what you have is this spectre of chaos or kind of ruthless conservatism in the form of Jenrick that hangs over Keir Starmer and his judgment. And that, I think, is the frame for the next 4 years.
The last thing, you go up to his office. Is it number 11? It's in number 11, isn't it?
Well, his office is in number 10. His flat is in number 11.
Did you go to the flat?
I did.
You went to the office, right?
Yeah, I went to the office and study, 2 different rooms he works in.
Keir Starmer's study. What's in there?
Right, I'll talk you through the office and the study. The office is downstairs. It's the same one that David Cameron used, Boris Johnson, Theresa May, and I've been in during those moments. Johnson had the big paintings from his mother on the wall, which again is reasonably telling. David Cameron, I remember showing me this present he got. Oh God, what was it? Was it Russian dolls from Putin anyway? Uh-oh. And there was some joke about them being bugged. I'm sure they were checked whether they were bugged or not.
But I hope those are going to skip somewhere now. Get rid of those.
And then Starmer took me in after our interview, and I couldn't see much that had changed, but the kind of mementos were gone. He's only been there a year, so he hasn't been handed all these, sorts of things anymore. He hasn't seen Putin or Xi in the way that Cameron did, and these big global figures. But I didn't see much there. It was a very workmanlike office. Apart from there was one photograph behind his desk of his wife and children, the kind of core of his identity. Fundamentally, his identity is of a good modern dad who's very different from how he was raised by his father. And I thought that was quite intriguing. And then he doesn't tend to work there. He goes upstairs, up through the famous staircase with all the pictures of the former prime ministers, and he goes through staterooms, and there is this place that he calls the study. And again, it's sort of untouched by his presence. It's just a formal room of inside number 10 with some nice sofas and, you know, old busts on the walls. And he sits there in the sofas with the nice light coming in front of a fire that doesn't work. And he reads his official papers. And he's 30 seconds from his new home in number 11. So I had this sense of a number 10 not entirely touched by his presence yet, that he was still detached. He was detached from Westminster, detached from number 10, detached from politics in some sense, yearning just to be with people in their place of work or with people who have suffered some kind of tragedy and to make things better. And that's the kind of the heart of Keir Starmer, I think.